Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
We've received a bunch of emails from our listeners. This first one is in response to my saying on one of the recent episodes how happy I was that my audio editing software now has an automatic bleep button. All I have to do is hit it and it bleeps you out. Steve W. writes in response, quote, "I'd rather listen to the bleeping language than the bleeping bleeps. Please turn the volume down."
See, what I heard there is he would rather not hear the bleeps at all. What you heard there was that he would rather if the volume were turned down. This is the perfect illustration of the differences between us.
Right. I read the words, "Please turn the volume down."
And I hear what he actually wants, not to hear bleeps at all.
Colin and Ann Karanek invited us to their wedding. They sent us email saying that if we're in the area during the wedding, which I believe was a week or 2 weeks ago, we apologize for being late in replying, that they'd be happy for us to attend. And Colin asked, is it true that you, James, actually do officiate at weddings?
It is, in fact, true. You can hire me to do your wedding. You probably don't want to, but you can. I've been known to give anti-marriage speeches in the middle of weddings.
Ben Ruby, who listens to us on YouTube, wrote a beautiful comment on our last episode on The Sound of Freedom. Ben Ruby says, quote, "Your analysis on what constitutes trafficking from the United Nations site is excellent. This episode won my trust that you are more capable of impartial, dispassionate analysis of anyone I've ever listened to.
Hey, thanks, man.
If you haven't already done an episode about the current problems in California, it would be interesting to hear your take on the recent movie called Leaving California. Keep up the great work of helping Americans come together through understanding."
Hey, let's go find that movie.
I know, yeah. So Ben Ruby, thanks for the tip.
Yeah, and look, if you and I started talking about the problems in California right this second, we would still be here in a year.
That's right. We could make an entire career of this.
That state is a mess. I remember the day I left. It was too late at night because, you have to pack up the truck and everything. And I got everything in the cars in the truck and we pulled out. And I remember seeing it disappear into the rearview mirror as I drove to Utah. I started giggling in the car. I was that happy. As it turns out, a couple of years later, when I pulled out of Utah, I giggled even harder because that was not the winning answer either. That I went to New York State, also not the winning answer, and then to Pennsylvania when I finally met you. So that wasn't so great either. Anyway, responding to emails is such a form of laziness. That's like saying, look, I couldn't find anything interesting to bring up this week, so I'm going to talk about all these
It's not like
things.
saying it. It's absolutely saying it.
All right, fair enough. I had a hard time finding stuff this week, too. It's been a slow news week if you don't care about anything named Trump or Biden, and I just don't right now. But I did come across this troubling story. Calls to mind a larger question that I've had for a while. The headline, "Mosquitoes that carry West Nile are becoming resistant to insecticides," CDC says.
Are we back to that again? Wasn't that the Armageddon of 15, 20 years ago, West Nile virus?
Yeah, but now our insecticides are not killing the mosquitoes. I'm on record as saying many, many times that I despise mosquitoes. There are apparently no positive things you can say about them, and they've killed more human beings than any other thing in global history.
Including war.
They are the most deadly thing on the face of the planet, historically speaking. And I've always said if there were a button on my desk and I could push it and all the mosquitoes would disappear, I would push it. Yet you and I talk about unintended consequences quite a bit, and we talk about the humility of not knowing what might happen if you do something. And honestly, I've never heard anybody say a word about any downside to ridding the planet of mosquitoes.
I'm sure that frogs or something eat them.
Oh, lots of things eat them, but all those things apparently eat other things too. There's literally not one thing anybody can point to say, look, this would be the catastrophic thing that would happen were we to rid the world of mosquitoes.
The environment is very much like the economy. And just like you can't shut down an entire industry without getting what you saw in the COVID lockdowns, you can't just eliminate an entire species and not expect some kind of fallout.
Yeah, every time you around with something, you end up finding out what the problem's going to be, but you always find out too late.
Yep.
If I had the button on my desk, would I still push it? Probably.
See, that's like everybody in power. You put the button of power in front of them. They can't help but push it.
I don't think it's that. I think it's a cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost? Unknown. What's the benefit? You rid the world of its greatest killer.
Mm-hmm.
I'd roll the dice on that one. I can't imagine the cost is beyond the benefit. That's not to say there wouldn't be a cost. I'm sure there would be.
Well, one of the unintended consequences, I can guarantee you, is that we're going to be getting hate mail from biologists telling us precisely what would happen if you push that button.
This brings us, of course, to the foolishness of the week. This week, Ant, we go to none other than Cornel West. I've got a soft spot in my heart for Cornel West. I always have. He opens his mouth and he says crazy things, and I start nodding my head, and I have to catch myself before I go crazy too. I used to assign his work when I was a professor. I would pick on it after everybody read it, but I would assign it. I think Cornell's a serious man and needs to be taken seriously. And his work with Robbie George, trying to bring civility to a larger world, is something well worth paying attention to. And yet, Cornell has decided yet again he's going to run for president, this time as the Green Party, eschewing both Republicans and Democrats. And how best to differentiate yourself from the competition? Well, start lobbing bombs at them. And Cornell takes issue with something that happened in 1981 in Seattle. In 1981, in Seattle, the city council there outlawed rent control.
Outlawed rent control.
Yeah, they said, we're not going to have rent control here.
Okay.
That's the smartest idea ever. I mean, if you want to guarantee that poor people can't afford housing anymore, have rent control. It's like minimum wage, right? You'll guarantee that a few of them get really nice apartments for very little money and that none of the rest of them get anything at all.
Right.
Cornell has taken issue with this and says to the city council, vote yes on rent control. It is a moral imperative. Here we have the problem in a nutshell. The thing that is a moral imperative is economic stupidity. It's easy to know what's going to happen next.
Oh, you don't even have to theorize. Just look around everywhere else it's been done.
That's right. Cornell, from his home near Princeton University, can't see people who have to afford things in a way that he doesn't. He should go live that life for a couple of months. Maybe he did when he was much younger. I don't know. If he did, he's certainly forgotten. My heart goes out to people who can't afford housing. We see it in city after city after city. And if you want people to be able to afford housing, stop regulating it. Allow builders to build and allow the market to set the rent.
This is one of those instances of government presenting itself as the cure for the malady that it caused. And you see this in California cities. You get regulations that hamstring housing development, so you get less housing. And of course, as a consequence of that, rent goes up. And then the government steps in and imposes rent control. Not only is it difficult to build more houses, you can't raise the price of the housing that does exist, which would in turn entice entrepreneurs to come in and build more of them. And what happens? When nothing turns out the way the government wants, they point to the landlords and say, well, it's their fault.
It's greed. And really what you end up with is they bring in a cat to eat the mouse that they've already introduced. They bring a dog to catch the cat, ... whale.
Right.
Rent control isn't going to work. I have no doubt that Seattle will implement rent control, and it will make Seattle even more of a third world banana republic city than it's already become.
We all know what's going to happen. It's going to be the landlord's fault. It's their greed, and we just need more government regulation. We just haven't figured out exactly what yet.
We've just got to turn those buttons exactly so, and everything will finally work out for the best.
We give a special shout out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers. For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org.
We've got all kinds of very old politicians, and they're causing all kinds of trouble. Everybody immediately went to Joe Biden and his advanced age, but I'm actually not thinking about him at all. I'm thinking about a couple of people in the United States Senate, Dianne Feinstein and Mitch McConnell. And I'm thinking about Mitch McConnell today because he had a bit of an episode yesterday. wherein he was standing at a podium and just stopped talking.
Yeah, I saw the clip. It was scary.
It was a little frightening, wasn't it? And, all partisan ranting to the side, it seemed to me that he was having some sort of neurological issue. Watching him at the podium, you can tell that something wasn't quite right. And it brought me to think about Dianne Feinstein. Now, Mitch McConnell is 81 at present. Dianne Feinstein is 90, and she's been having all sorts of mental issues. When you watch Senator Feinstein try to go about her business, it's clear she can't. And you start thinking about, how old is too old? Is there such a thing? Is this going to be so idiosyncratic that we can't say, once you hit 90, you're too damn old? I remember back when Reagan was running for president, we thought he was so old at the time. Looking back on it, he was a spring chicken compared to what we've got now.
What was he, like 69 or something when he took office?
Yeah, the constant refrain was, oh my God, he's going to be 70 years old as he walks into the presidency.
Right. And compare that to Joe Biden. Joe Biden was 78 when he took office.
82 right now, I guess that would be, or 81 maybe. These are not young people, and they're suffering from the sorts of things that not young people often suffer from. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush here. I'm just asking the obvious question. At what point are we willing to look up and say, yeah, you know what? I think this is maybe a bit too old for us to be comfortable with. I don't know what the right answer to that question is.
I think we have a mandatory retirement age in the military for just this reason, that you get to a certain age and mentally you just can't operate at the level you need to operate at. So if it's required for the military, why not for elected officials, certainly for the commander-in-chief of the military?
All I can say to that is that I'm unaware of what the rules are in the military regarding age. I'm not surprised, and I'll take your word for it, but I'd never heard that before. When we think about politicians, I think we've got a completely different set of problems, because we've got some Supreme Court case law sitting in the background that is going to cause real issues with anybody who wants to add qualifications onto anything we have to do in terms of what our politicians are able to accomplish.
Right. You've got to have a constitutional amendment.
I think there's no way around that, because people used to say things like, well, we should just term limit our politicians out of office. Problem solved. And yes, this problem would have been solved had we term limited politicians out of office. We tried doing that in a number of different places, and various states started adding different things to their own law, which would require certain things. In this case, they would require politicians to leave office after 2 or 4 or 6 terms, whatever the case may be, much like the president does after 2 presidential terms.
Which, by the way, is due to a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And people tend to forget that. But, when the Supreme Court heard the case, and the case was called U.S. Term Limits versus Thornton, it was heard in 1994 and decided in 1995. We'll give you a link in the show notes to that case so you can go get a look at it for yourself. What the court decided was that a state couldn't add qualifications to the constitutional list of qualifications. Okay, the Constitution requires, in the case of the House of Representatives, that a candidate be 25 years of age or older. The state can't come in and decide, yeah, that's great, but we're going to decide that it's going to be 32 years of age or older.
Right.
You would see that that wouldn't appear to violate the Constitution.
Right, because 32 or older is 25 or older.
That's right. But according to the court, it would have, because simply it adds more qualifications to a pre-existing list that the Constitution has already given us. You can agree or disagree with that all you like, but the court has spoken. Can you add a top age? I don't think you can, not without benefit of a constitutional amendment. And I think it might be wise to start talking about the need for a constitutional amendment to specify an outer age range right now, not only for the president, but for every elected office in the federal government.
But when you start to talk about maximum ages and similarly maximum number of terms, it sounds to me the sort of argument someone would make who's on the losing side of an election, That is, we throw it to the voters and we say, vote for who you want. And if the voters want the guy who's been elected previously 10 times and who's 90 years old, well, that's who the voters select.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that argument, as you well know, right? Every time somebody makes that argument, you see me nodding my head to it. If the voters want something other than what they're getting, they could easily vote for something other than what they're getting.
Right.
If they choose not to, well, then they choose not to. Now, the rejoinder is, let's take Senators McConnell and Feinstein as two cases in point. In California and Kentucky, where they both serve, clearly, you're always going to get a Democrat in California and you're always going to get a Republican in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. And incumbents will always run. You see how this is going to end up working. It's going to take really extreme circumstances. And I think we finally gotten there with Senator Feinstein, who won't be running at age 90 to, still be serving at age 96. Boy, it's going to take quite a lot to get these people not to run, especially when running as an incumbent in a safe state all but guarantees that they will get their seat back no matter what they do.
Yeah, and when you say all but guarantees, that's about right. I ran across some numbers going back to 1960 for the Senate and for the House. The probability of an incumbent being reelected in the Senate, of course it varies, but it averages about 80% in the Senate. In the House, it's about 95%. If you're elected once, there's a 95% chance you're going to get elected again.
I don't know if I believe that at first blush, but I'm going to let it slide for now because it's not so crazy I automatically disbelieve it.
Yeah, see, it's not that crazy, yeah. But I think there are two opposing arguments here. One is that, of course, there's some kind of incumbent effect. You have the benefit of being a brand name and people know they've experienced you. They have some sense that you know what you're doing. All of that goes with incumbency. But there's also an argument that incumbents are likely to get reelected simply because they're good. That is, they were good enough to get elected the first time, which necessarily means they're likely good enough to get elected the second time.
Well, when incumbents lose, it's typically because they're not good.
Right. They have to be really bad to lose.
They've done something so horrible that the voters all are aware of it and they know that there's an option. We've got an interesting case coming up here in Arizona where our Senator, Kristen Sinema, has left the Democratic Party. Now, as a Democrat, she was probably going to walk to re-election. As an independent, she's almost assured of being shown the door. So it's not exactly incumbency, right? We all know there's more to it than that. There's something about party that drifts right below the surface here that really matters. So there's all kinds of things. There's core competence, which matters. Mm-hmm. But, when you take it all and you put it into a cauldron and you brew it up, this is about what you end up getting.
Now that you raised party, it leads me down a new path of thinking, and that is the party itself has a goal. That is to get as many representatives, senators from that party elected. And so the party, which controls a bunch of money that can be used for campaigns, looks around and says, here's a bunch of currently elected representatives who are likely to win re-election just on their credentials. And then here's another set who are currently sitting in Congress, but are likely not to win re-election because they're not very good. So let's take our resources that would otherwise be spread over all of the congressmen and plow them into those marginal cases. And so the marginal cases now win.
Yeah, when a party realizes that they've got a representative who's very likely not to win, that representative gets nothing by way of resources anymore. If you're not going to win anyway, push those resources to the very close cases.
Okay, but then we've got two extremes here. The cases that are slam dunk, they're not going to get funding. There's no need to fund them. The lost cases aren't going to get funding. There's no point in funding them.
The slam dunk cases get some. Those cases that are certainly not going to win regardless, they tend not to get much of anything at all. And then you've got the odd case, and I keep coming back to Sinema because this is an odd case, right? What are they to do with a senator like Kristen Sinema? It's hard to know what the right answer is there because, frankly, she's a lousy Democrat if you're a Democrat. Mm-hmm. She's not what you want. She does her own thing. Now, she's what we all say that we want, but when push comes to shove, the parties don't want this. They don't want this at all. They want people who will do exactly what they want them to.
See, you just said something interesting. She's what we say we want. So, too, we say that we don't want these incumbents in there for decades on end, and yet how do we act? We reelect them.
Over and over and over again, and we don't squawk when they decide they're going to run again, nor do we demand that somebody get in against them in some sort of primary. It's inconceivable that somebody would try to primary Mitch McConnell out of a job.
Yeah.
And yet, what did we see yesterday? We saw him lose the ability to speak in public. Wow. I mean, this wasn't that he got tongue-tied. It wasn't that he got a little confused and looked around the room wondering what the hell was going on.
Oh, no, he was deer in the headlights.
He lost the ability to speak. And when you look at Feinstein at age 90, does she even know what she's supposed to be doing in Washington, D.C. anymore? There's a lot of evidence that she doesn't. She shows up and she just starts saying and doing things that she should never be saying or doing given the context.
Well, now, this is very interesting because one of the arguments I make against term limits is that if we term limited politicians, we would get into a situation where the bureaucracy, the unelected government officials, are running the show because those are the ones that have the institutional memory, that they've been around long enough. But you just made an argument that goes the other direction, that if the politician gets old enough and senile enough, maybe not the bureaucrats, but it's, in this case, Feinstein's staff is calling the shots, who also are unelected.
Well, we've been there a lot of times for a lot of years. Ultimately, I don't think there's much we're ever going to be able to do about that specific argument, right? We're always going to end up there in one way, shape, or form. The question becomes, how are we most likely to minimize that? Not do away with it entirely, but minimize it. Because what you're really saying, something like, look, Supreme Court clerks do most of the heavy lifting for justices who aren't thinking straight anymore.
Right.
Well, yeah, of course that's how it's going to go. The question isn't whether that's true, and not even whether we can do away with that. We can't. But can we minimize it in any way? And if you can minimize it somehow, then it would, I think, behoove you to do that. So how could we minimize that? Now I don't know. I don't know if adding a top-end age limit to these various offices would fall into the same category as a term limit, because it sure does act the same way. It's telling you that if you're elected at age 80, well, you can only have so many terms from here on out, and, well, that's definitionally a term limit.
Right.
And whether that's a good idea or not is not the relevant question. The relevant question is it constitutional? No matter what we decide to do here, and I think sooner or later we're going to have to decide to do something, no matter what we decide to do, it's going to require some form of constitutional amendment. It's going to have to take that shape.
And what do you think the odds are in today's political climate where we just seem to be divided on everything? What are the odds of passing a constitutional amendment that requires 2/3 majorities at several steps?
I think that the odds of passing a constitutional amendment are always long. What have we had? And we've had 27 of them, and the first 10 happened in 1791. That's the Bill of Rights. So that means we've got 17 since. One of those was to implement prohibition, and another was to finally do away with prohibition. That leaves us with, roughly speaking, 15th Amendments throughout the vast majority of our history. That's about one every 20 years. We don't do this very often, and with good reason. We shouldn't do it very often. Every time you have an amendment, it cheapens the rest of the constitutional text and the other amendments that we have. If you need evidence of this, go look at a state constitution that allows amendment every year and ask how many people even know what those constitutions say.
Right.
I lived in California, a frequently amended state constitution. And to this day, I have no idea what the state constitution of California requires. Look, we don't have many. It's hard to accomplish it, but here's, I think, where we're going in the right direction, where it might be possible. We can point to examples on both sides of the aisle that we could all agree are problematic. How did we lead here today? We didn't really lead by saying Joe Biden's too old to be president. We led by saying Mitch McConnell and Dianne Feinstein are probably too old to be senators.
Mm-hmm.
That's two different states. It's a member of each party. This doesn't seem to be a partisan statement that we're making. I certainly don't intend it as a partisan statement as I'm making it. So if we can say those things, it might actually be possible to get somewhere.
And the fact is, I would imagine that the only people who are concerned about McConnell and Feinstein, largely speaking, are those who don't live in their districts. That is, the people who McConnell serves, the people who Feinstein serves, are quite happy with those two, at least in terms of what they've been delivering.
Well, the people of California and Kentucky keep voting them in, so you have some evidence on your side here. Although I have to think that a good number of the people in those states are embarrassed by what their elected leaders are doing. Look, economists talk about something that political scientists don't, and that's perverse incentives. And perverse incentives are going to yield perverse outcomes. If outcomes are what matters, well, then you have to talk about that.
As a side note, I calculated the fraction of U.S. presidents who did or did not win re-election. You would think that's an easy thing to do, but you've got to take out people who died in office prior to their having the opportunity to run a second time. You've got, who's the guy that had 2 terms separated? Grover Cleveland. You've got Grover Cleveland, who was elected once, lost, and then 4 years later ran again and won. So he actually counts on both sides. He's an incumbent who lost and an incumbent who won.
As will Trump.
If Trump does, yeah.
And then let me give you another layer of confusion. Are you counting people who ran but didn't secure the nomination?
No, these are only ones who secured the nomination, right? So it becomes even more complicated in that case. Oddly, as I was going through this, we had a period in our history I was unaware of, about 20 years, where we had 8 one-term presidents in a row. And not because they were incumbents who failed to win re-election. Only one of them lost re-election. That was Martin Van Buren. The other 7 just chose not to run again. I think maybe one of them died.
Boy, if we could have guys like that again.
But if you take out those edge cases and you look strictly at those who were elected once, ran a second time and lost, and those who were elected ran a second time and won, and in Roosevelt's case, won several times, what you find is about 35% of them are those one-timers. 35% of them are incumbents who could not win re-election. 65% of them were incumbents who did win re-election. Now, there's not a lot of presidents here. We're talking about a total of 32 when you're done. But nonetheless, it points in that same direction of an incumbency effect.
I don't know what to say about this. The entire system seems to yield this outcome. And then we all get shocked and horrified when we get this outcome. If you really don't like it, start voting for people who are not incumbents.
I want to say one thing about ages, because people are on about Biden's age. I don't disagree. However, life expectancy, and you have to be careful with life expectancy, because life expectancy numbers that people quote and they show how they go up over time, they're largely due to reduced infant mortality. But if you look at a different number, and this is life expectancy for people age 65, so you're past the infancy, you're past adulthood, all of that. Life expectancy at age 65, back in 1940, it was roughly 78 years of age. Today, it's about 84. Life expectancy for those over 65 has gone up 10% since 1940. However, you still have this phenomenon of Biden getting elected, and relative to his life expectancy, he's still older than all of the presidents before him. But the point, I think, and the more I think of it, the more concerned I become by it. You've got somebody who's making decisions that impact 320 million people.
He makes decisions that impact every person on the globe.
Yeah, impacting billions of people. Shouldn't there be some requirement that this person be mentally agile?
There should be, and I don't know how you get that in there. I don't know what standard you might use to accomplish that end. And I think we would all agree that that end is laudable and that's one that we should be chasing. How to secure it, I don't think we're going to get anything close to agreement. And ultimately, as is the case with every political problem we have, This one's on us.
Right.
We own this. This is our problem.
I was hearing your voice in my head. You get the government you deserve.
You do, and this is our problem, right? Because we've decided that winning is more important than having a competent candidate. So if we know that somebody who's got mush for a brain can win, we're just going to keep running her until she literally can't do it anymore. Well, that's no way to go about your business. You should want somebody who can do the job. And we're willing to trade off on one side to earn a victory. I wish we were better than this, but we're not. And I'm not in the business of saying that if things were different, they wouldn't be the same. This is what we do. Well, okay, if this is what we do, don't bitch and moan that we get substandard candidates. It's your fault that we do. You laugh, but I'm right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet we're going to keep right on doing it. Democrats are lining up behind Joe Biden right now to run again. And I don't see a whole lot of evidence to indicate that that's the smart play. Not electorally, but governmentally. I'm not talking about whether they can win electorally. Of course they can, especially if the Republicans are dumb enough to nominate Donald Trump again. Joe Biden's already proven he could beat Donald Trump. It wouldn't surprise me at all if he did it a second time. But how smart a thing is that? Do you really want 4 more years of Joe Biden? Shouldn't you want better than that?
Yeah, but see, somehow our elections over the past decade or so have become less about who we want than who we don't want.
It's longer than 10 years, but agreed. If you want better, demand it, and then it'll happen. One way to demand it would be to start working on a constitutional amendment to put upper age limits on elected office. We have lower age limits, so the idea that you must be a certain age is not repulsive to us.
Right. Why? Because you need a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of training, learning. So why not on the other end?
Until you see some movement trying to accomplish these things, you can figure that you're left with exactly what you've been getting for the past few decades. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.